In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, praise be to God, prayers and peace be on Prophet Muhammad, his kinship and companions. Dear attendants, distinguished attendants, you are welcome to this workshop. And in this beautiful morning with teaching and evaluating for creativity and innovation, the blending of creativity and teaching will have a fruitful output. What a beautiful when there is creativity in teaching. It's more beautiful to apply creativity in teaching. We will have the creative teacher and the innovative and creative teacher. Today we have a long expertise of the international expertise attracted to this forum. We will listen and we will benefit from Professor Jonathan Blacker. He is a professor. He worked previously as professor of educational psychology in Indiana University. He was the founder and director of the Assessment and Educational Policy Center. He has more than 100 assessment projects throughout the last 10 years inside the United States and several countries as well. He has got several prizes for his paper and research works from several organizations: the U.S. Society for Psychology, the National Society for Talented Children. He is a fellow of the U.S. Society of Psychology and the U.S. Society for Dr. Johnson. He is one of the best 100 academicians with influence on the educational policy in the United States. This is the best thing I will leave the floor to him. He will have about 70 minutes. We stress mobiles should be on silent. And as for the questions and remarks, it will be sent to the mobile on the floor, on the wall. For remarks, it's 0569626438. You will see it in front of you. The last 20 minutes will be for discussions through SMS to the mobile number I told you. You may have the floor, Doctor. And thank you for your effort and time and visiting us, and we hope to benefit from him to the utmost.
Good morning. Good morning. Salam. God has blessed me in many ways. I have a beautiful family. I have a great job. And I get to travel the world studying creativity, which is a lot of fun. Creativity is a strange concept in that it's cognitive, it's social, it has to do with attitude, it has to do with effort, and people in every culture are fascinated with it. So when the notes I put together, there are probably about 6 hours worth of material here. So I'm going to skip around a little bit. I've posted all of the slides to the web. And at the end, I'm going to give you the address where you can download the whole thing. I'm going to spend a little less time talking about assessment today, because that just takes a lot of time. All the notes are there, though. And then we recently published a book on assessing creativity. And if you're interested in that, I have forms where you can order one at a discount. And I'll pass those out at the end. So most of what I'm going to spend my time talking about this morning is really trying to help us understand better what is creativity. And then I'm going to briefly talk about what is creativity, and we're especially going to talk about how people have traditionally tried to make people more creative. There are very traditional models that we've used for about 60 years. And in our experience, they only work a little bit. So my team has come up with a new way to do it that we think works better. And we're going to spend some time talking about that today. So let's get started. What is creativity? So, as I said at the very beginning, creativity just fascinates people in almost every culture. The idea of creating something new that hadn't come before, that helps solve your problems, is useful to every person. Most cultures hold people who are creative in very high esteem. We value creativity. At the same time, both creators and the media like creativity to be mysterious. But we have over 100 years of studies that tell us that it's not mysterious. That we know a lot about creativity. But we have all these myths about creativity. Most of which we know are not true. But when people try to teach creativity, they act as though those myths are true. And that really holds us back. That really holds us back. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those myths. We've identified about 12 of them that really cause problems, but we're just going to talk about 2 today because we don't have a lot of time. The most common myth, the number one myth, is that creativity cannot be enhanced. I talk to teachers all over the world who tell me that creativity cannot be enhanced. We've known for at least 30 years that that's not true. We know how to make almost every person more creative. Our rough estimate is even when I teach a creativity course, about 75% of students believe that creativity can't be enhanced. And those are students taking a creativity course, and they still believe that. But we know it's not true. We know it's not true. Here's another one. Risk-taking is commonly associated with creativity. You hear that myth a lot, right? To be creative, you've got to be a risk taker. Take risks. That's not true at all. Jumping off a building is a risk. Not all risk is the same. A mistake we see children make, especially teenagers, so between 14 and 18, is that they like to take risks. And many of those risks are really stupid, bad risks. And sometimes when you say to them, why did you take those risks? They say, I was trying to be creative. It's a stupid excuse. Not true at all. Not true at all. So risk management is associated with creativity. People talk about Bill Gates, Microsoft, right? And they say he's a risk taker. He was, but he was a risk manager. Those are not the same things. So he would take very big risks, but he carefully considered those risks. One of the best examples probably is Microsoft worked on web TVs 20 years ago. It was a risk. It didn't work out, so they put it aside. 20 years later, what are we starting to see? People using web TVs. Microsoft is way ahead of everybody else. So he took a careful risk, he thought about it carefully, did some creative work, realized that the time was not right, people were not ready for it yet, so he put it aside. He didn't get rid of it. He managed his risks carefully. He managed his risks carefully. We have lots of examples of very creative people managing risks carefully. So again, it's risk management is associated with creativity, not risk taking. Let's do one more. This is very popular. I run into this all over the world. Creativity is enhanced when evaluation and external constraints are minimized. So I will hear teachers say things like, I'm not going to evaluate the student's creativity. Or I'm not going to give them too many constraints because I don't want to hurt their creativity. The problem is that that's not true at all. How often in life do you work without any constraints? It never happens, right? There are always constraints on the work we do as adults. Always. And then when we interview very creative people, or really anybody, and we ask them, what's the most creative thing that you've ever done? They almost always tell us about a high constraint situation. And so people will say things like, well, I wrote this story when people told me that I couldn't do it. Or I invented something when people said there was no solution. Those are, by definition, high constraint situations. People telling you you can't do something, but you turned it around and used it as motivation to do something creative. So to say that constraints are bad, there are no bad constraints. There can be too little or too much, but there are always constraints. And we are always evaluated, always. So when I hear teachers say we shouldn't evaluate creativity, I think, but if you're not evaluating them, someone else is. The other students are, or we evaluate ourselves, right? We evaluate ourselves. Let me give this example. This is a famous study that was done about 30 years ago. And they separated students into 3 groups. One group was given very basic instructions. Write a story about an animal. The third group was given detailed instructions. Much too much detail. A page of instructions about how to write the story. The group in the middle was given some reasonable constraints, some reasonable instructions. They let them write their stories, do their art projects, and then they came back and they evaluated how creative each of the group's projects were. The group in the middle was by far the most creative. They've had reasonable constraints. The group with too many constraints got frustrated. The group with too few constraints got frustrated. Which makes sense, right? If you have too little guidance, it's hard to get started. If you have too much guidance, you want people to leave you alone so you can do your work. The group in the middle started first, finished first, had the most fun, and did the best quality work in terms of creativity. So reasonable constraints. A better strategy for us is to teach students how to work with constraints. Instead of using constraints as an excuse for why they can't be creative, use constraints as a tool to be more creative. That's a very different mindset from how we usually teach creativity. But it matches how, as adults, we like to be creative. And I think this is a very important point. If there are no constraints, you will put constraints on yourself when you're trying to be creative. You sometimes can be your own worst enemy for creativity. Oh, I can't do this, or I don't have the right tools, or I don't have enough time, or the problem's too hard to solve. Those are all constraints that you put on yourself. Self-constraining behaviors is what we call them. So when we're working with teachers, we try to emphasize you need to use sensible constraints, reasonable guidance, and make sure that your expectations are clear. In the end, the most important constraint are the expectations. How will I be evaluated after this is done? If you're just being creative for yourself, if you're painting for yourself, you will ask that question of yourself and not even realize it. So constraints. Constraints are much more complicated than people realize. And they usually are a friend of creativity, not the enemy. Not the enemy. So, I'm going to now I'm going to explain. So we really need to define creativity. We have all these myths, and most of the myths come from the fact that we haven't defined creativity well. So about a decade ago, some colleagues and I went back and we read about 1,000 papers on creativity just to see how people defined it. they all defined it a little differently, which is part of the problem. How can we really teach something if we can't agree on what it is? So I'm going to just walk you through what we did to come to a definition of creativity. And we do believe that this sentence is true. That we can make any person, any group, any family, anyone more creative. We know how to do that. We've done it many times. Someone did ask me, and this is a joke, but someone did ask me, well, what about someone with brain damage? Well, probably not them, but everybody else. Everybody else. Okay. A good definition of creativity should be able to do all these things, we think. That creativity may look different in different contexts. If you're an architect, creativity for you may be very different from a preschool teacher's creativity. And that's okay. The definition has to recognize that creativity, it's not just in the brain. It comes from lots of different influences. Social, psychological, sociological. Importantly, that what I think is creative and what you think is creative may be different. And I think this is really important. That what my children do may be creative, but if I do it, the same thing, it may not be creative. It has to account for that difference. And this is our definition. I'm going to read it once, and then we'll go through the pieces of it. Creativity is the interaction among aptitude, process, and environment by which an individual or group produces a product that is both novel and useful within a social context. Almost any definition of creativity has novelty, uniqueness. It's not something that happens all the time. And most of them have usefulness. So the idea has to be both unique and useful. That makes it creative. We added that there has to be a product, there has to be a thing, and that thing may be an idea that you share with somebody, but there has to be some evidence that it exists. And then the first part talks about the fact that creativity results from lots of different things combining together. Lots of different things combining together. And then this part we added within a social context. And what basically says is something that happens in this room we may think of as creative, but if it happened in a classroom, maybe it's not. If it happened in a business, maybe it's not, and vice versa. So where and when it happens matters. Where and when it happens matters. An example. So these are my children. They are not this young and cute anymore. Every year where we used to live, they would have an art contest. And all these artists would come, and they would have 6 hours to paint whatever they wanted. And then they would be evaluated at the end. Well, it would make no sense to put the children's paintings with the adults' paintings, right? That would be a strange social context. It wouldn't make sense. According to some definitions, you should, which is just strange. They need to be judged in their own context. My son was probably 3 years old in this picture. He's about 7 now. He was actually younger than that. And that's his masterpiece. He was very proud of that. And for him, that was probably creative. It was different. It was very useful for him. He judged it as creative, and so did we. My daughter's painting, which you can't see, was much more detailed. It wasn't as good as a 50-year-old's painting. Does that mean it wasn't creative? Well, of course it was creative. It was novel and useful for her and her family. So it fits the definition. I'm going to tell a funny story about my grandfather. So I was visiting. He's about 85 years old now. This is about 7 or 8 years ago, and he was always a gardener. Tomatoes, pumpkins, cucumbers, eggplant. He was a fantastic gardener. And I went to go visit him, and he was very excited, very excited. And he's normally a very quiet man, very quiet. So I thought that was strange. Why he's so excited? And he said, "Oh, I have to show you something. I'm so excited." And he ran outside. And this is in his front yard. And he says, "Look how tall this is." And he's a short man, but this was about this tall. He was so proud. He said, "I've worked all summer to grow this. Isn't it beautiful?" And I said, "Isn't that a weed? Why did you grow a weed?" And he said, "For 60 years, I've been fighting these weeds. So I decided to see if I could grow the tallest weed in the world." And he did. It was about 7 feet tall. Is that unique? Is that novel? Is that different? Very different. Very different. Was it useful? Not to me. Not to you. Not to my grandmother. You can't see my grandmother, but she's standing right here doing this. She thinks this is stupid. Totally stupid. And this is in the front yard. So she was so embarrassed. Was it useful to him? Very. I have literally never seen him happier or more excited in his entire life. For him, it was creative. For the rest of us, probably not. It was creative for me because I like to see my grandfather happy. So it fits the definition well. It fits the definition well. This is a brief tangent, but people always want to know how creativity and intelligence are related. And this gets very complicated. In general, we know that they are related, but we're not really sure how. It's very complicated. Some people think that creativity is part of intelligence. Some people think intelligence is part of creativity. Some people think they're different, but they overlap. I suspect that they're related, but they're definitely not the same thing. Intelligence is pretty much just of the mind. Creativity is much more social at the same time. There have been some studies just in the last couple of years that have pretty strong evidence that the more intelligent you are, the more creative you are. But there's really only 2 studies that have found that so far. Traditionally, people believed that up to a certain point, intelligence helped creativity, but after that, it did not anymore. But as we've gotten better with assessment, it looks like they may be related all the way. And I'm going to skip that. Okay. So we've defined creativity. We've talked about some of the myths that cause problems for us. Well, how have people traditionally tried to increase creativity? There have been widespread creativity training programs around the world for over 50, 60 years. For over 50, 60 years. And they usually involve just this first step, which is teach students to use creativity techniques. And there are lots of different ones. Brainstorming, Scamper is another one. The whole point being giving people techniques so they come up with lots of ideas. And that's based on the belief that the more ideas you have, the better the odds that you're going to have a novel and useful idea. Makes sense, makes sense. Part of the problem is when we've evaluated these programs, they often don't work. People will come up with lots of ideas that aren't useful and aren't novel. But we keep trying these same programs. And so some of my colleagues and I were sitting around about 15 years ago, and we said, but this never works. Why doesn't this work? Maybe we're doing it wrong. So again, first, use creativity techniques. Second, maybe those traditional programs let you practice the techniques. Third, maybe you look at the environment and how constraints play a role. And fourth, and this almost never happened, look at people's beliefs and attitudes. Look at those myths. And we said, you know what? This is backwards. This is completely backwards, right? I'm giving you tools, but I'm not finding out if you want to use the tools. I'm not helping you find environments where you can use the tools. And I'm not helping you practice using the tools. So of course this doesn't work. It's totally backwards. And so we came up with a new model. We start by looking at attitudes and beliefs. We do lots of problem-based learning activities that get students to question how they define creativity. Get them to break down their stereotypes. When they've done that, then we give them creativity techniques to use to solve real problems that they have in their own lives. So again, get them ready psychologically to be creative. Then give them the tools and context. We've turned that old model around. And we really encourage them to interact with constraints. We do lots of hands-on activities where they have to be creative regardless of constraints. And then we have them practice in different contexts. Practice transfer, which is the hardest part of learning, right? Transferring learning to new situations. And then after we've done that with them, We go right back to the beginning and say, okay, what other myths and stereotypes about creativity do you have now? A constant monitoring process. And we found that after doing this for just a couple months with students, they start to do this by themselves from now on. It becomes very self-motivating. They're constantly questioning their own beliefs. And this works well enough that by the time we get to this point, we surprise them with a project. They come into class and we tell them, you have a week to invent something. And even the most confident student, creatively, will go, I can't invent anything. We give them a few basic tools to use, and then we just encourage them to keep these things in mind. Every student invents something. Every student invents something. Are they all great inventions? No. Many of them are. Many of them are impressive. And so they present their inventions back to the class. The class gives them feedback. You should do this. Why did you do this? Try something new. And then we surprise the students and tell them, okay, you have 5 days. And then you're going to present your inventions to the public. A very real-world test of creativity. The students take it very seriously. And so again, it's a process. So again, this is the traditional model. Teach creativity techniques, and then maybe do these things. Our model is the exact opposite. Teach about attitudes toward creativity. Teach about how to work with constraints. Maybe teach techniques if they need them, but it's all in context. So especially if we're working with college students, we have them go out and figure out what their biggest problem is. That's as contextual as you can get. And then we'll give them techniques to solve their personal problems. It makes it very personal for them. Makes it very personal for them. Believe it or not, we also find that if you go in this direction as opposed to this direction, you often don't have to teach them creativity techniques. People are naturally creative, right? Have you ever seen a little child that wasn't creative? People are naturally creative. We find that if you help people with these two parts, they will teach themselves these without much of your help, which we think is really interesting. So in many ways, this model tries to tell people how they should be creative. Our model helps people discover that they already are creative. And we think that's why this model has very little long-term evidence of success. We've been collecting data on this for about 15 years, and we have much better long-term success with it. Much better long-term success. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this because we've got the book and it would take us 3 hours. You don't want to listen to me talk about creativity assessment for 3 hours, but we actually have some very good ways to assess creativity. Better than people think we do. The assessments are not as good as intelligence tests or achievement tests. We've only been doing creativity assessment really for about 50 years. We've been doing those other assessments for over 100. We just need a little more time to get them to a good spot. And before I do this, one technique that people talk about a lot is brainstorming. How many of you know about brainstorming? Brainstorming. Sit around, come up with as many ideas as you can as a group, you write them down. There have been hundreds of studies done on brainstorming. Almost all of them have evidence that brainstorming does not work. Brainstorming makes you less creative. So if we came up with a problem as a group today, and I said, okay, as a group, let's come up with as many ideas as we can to solve this problem. You would do better if I gave you the problem, had you go off by yourself, come up with your own list, and then come back. And then come back. That's a bit of evidence we have that creativity is very social. You'll be influenced by other people's ideas in the same room. And people are very conscious of status. So even if you don't think that other people in the room have higher status than you, your brain picks up on that. And if someone important says, I don't like that idea, your brain will become less creative. Hundreds of studies have shown this. And yet we still use brainstorming all the time. I was at an advertising firm in London, and they brought me in to talk about brainstorming. And I said, I will, but it doesn't work. And they were like, no, it works. Everyone knows that it works. And so I actually had them stop brainstorming. And I said, you can work as a group, but you have to come up with your ideas separately and then bring them to the meeting. And some of the people really did not want to do that because it didn't fit their stereotype of creativity. But they quickly found that their ideas got better over time. So that's really good evidence. One, of the definition that we're using. Two, that creativity has a big social component. And it can be good or it can be bad. And three, that we've studied this enough that we know how to help people be more creative at the same time. So the next time someone asks you to brainstorm, say, no. Major types of creativity assessment. I've already talked to you about this book. And again, I have discount forms here if you'd like one. I'm going to move through these very quickly. And again, all of these slides are posted on the internet, and I'll show you where to go to get them so you don't have to write them down. The simplest way is to ask people how creative they are. How accurate they are depends on the culture, interestingly. It's no secret that if you ask Americans how good they are at something, they will always say they're great at it. If you ask Australians tend to be much more reasonable. So, I mean, it depends on the culture. But for the most part, if they don't think it's high stakes, if they don't think it's an important question, they'll be honest. If they think it's important, people will say they're more creative than they think they are. So it's not the best way to find out. There's an interesting phenomenon that we've discovered lately in cognitive psychology. The worse people are at something, if you ask them a question like this, the better they will tell you they are. So in a sense, you get a lot of false positives. Another way is you can give them a personality test. Questions like, I like to solve complex problems. I have a vivid imagination. I love to daydream. It's a little bit harder to fake, and they're decent instruments. They're decent instruments. But it looks a lot like personality. And changing personality is really hard. So we don't find them to be the most useful instruments in the world. Past creative performance. So this is where we'll give people a list of activities that are creative. And we ask them to check all the ones that they've done. This tends to be one of the best measures of creativity, because the best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. But that makes it tough with little kids, right? Observations, where you actually go in and watch people working, watch students learning, and you look for certain creative behaviors. Two problems with that. One is people don't like being watched. That's true across cultures. And that people act differently when they know you're watching them. It takes a lot of time to observe for creativity. So this is the most commonly used measure of creativity. Divergent thinking tests. The most common is the Torrance test of creative thinking. It's been translated into every major language. There's an Arabic version of it. But they're all basically the same. And they all involve giving someone a problem to solve, and they have to come up with as many solutions as they can. The more, the better. Guilford's alternate uses test is probably the most used in research. And it would be something like, name as many things as you can that have a wheel. Or another popular one is list as many uses for a brick as you can think of. A brick. Brick. Okay. So then the more ideas you come up with, you get a higher score. And the more original the ideas are, you get a higher score. This is by far the most popular type of creativity test in the entire world. The Torrance test is used regularly in about 80 or 90 countries. So this is another example. Think of all the different things that would happen if people did not need sleep. List as many as you can in the next 2 minutes. And we've learned, and this is really interesting, the easiest way to make people more creative when they do this is to tell them to be creative. And their scores will go up. And so we score these different ways. Fluency, how many ideas did you have? Fluency. Flexibility, how many different categories did you list? How many different types of ideas? Originality, how unique or different were your answers? And then elaboration, how detailed were your responses? Fluency is the most popular score. And originality is the second most popular score. There are good parts and bad parts with divergent thinking tests. The good is that they tend to be reliable and valid. There's some evidence, that divergent thinking test scores taken when you're a child predict adult creativity. They take a lot of time. They're expensive. You can kind of cheat on them. But the biggest part is, let's go back to our definition. Unique and useful, right? Divergent thinking tests help us with unique, but not useful. So they have that weakness. Let me skip that one. Okay, I'm going to do a quick activity. If you have a pen and paper in front of you, I want you to draw the details on a coin. So just a coin. What's whatever a Saudi Arabian coin would be? Yeah. Just draw the details on a coin. Go ahead and draw it for me. What does the coin look like? Do you remember? Okay, you can stop. You can stop. Just one. That's a very good. Overachiever, impressive. I like that. Okay. Oh, very good. Very good. Okay. I don't care what it looks like. I care about how big you drew the circle. Did I tell you to draw it small? I know, right? Is it easier or harder to do it if it's small? It's harder if it's small, right? You want to draw it big. Did I tell you to do it small? Oh, big? Ooh, 3D. That's very impressive. Very good. Very good. That's a little bigger. But most people draw it about the same size. A couple bigger ones. A small. A couple small. Very big. Very good. I've done this in many countries. About 3/4 of people draw it small or smaller than it really is. Tiny. No more than 25% actually draw it bigger. You put constraints on yourself. You are your own worst enemy for creativity. But that also means you can be your best friend for creativity if you learn not to put those constraints on yourself. I did not help you, though, by holding up a small coin, right? If I had held up a big coin, you would have drawn it bigger. And if I held up a tiny coin, you would have drawn it very tiny. So instructions matter. Your own constraints are something that you have to fight about, which is why we created this new model. Help people monitor their own constraints. But instructions really do matter. So when you're working with students and you're giving them instructions, you have to be very careful on how you word things. Because if people can interpret the instructions in any way that's negative toward creativity, they will. So in instructions, how you word the simplest instruction is very, very important. Is very, very important. So just a few more comments here, and then we'll move to questions. Since the big theme of the conference is evaluation, I wanted to share some thoughts on how I think you should evaluate when you're trying to help people be more creative, especially students. Should use both quantitative and qualitative data, because creativity is so multifaceted, cognitive, personality, social, etc. You should really focus on a range of outcomes. Again, going back to our definition and going back to our model, if you try over the short term to change students' creativity, you may not change their behaviors immediately, but you may change their attitudes. That's not a bad thing, that's good. But you have to look for it. Whenever you can, you should do before and after to see how much change there is, especially with young students, because some of them may be so creative already. If you just measure at the end, you may not realize that they haven't changed. So, and then again, creativity is a lifelong skill. When we're working with students, the goal is to help them be creative the rest of their lives. A mistake we make when we evaluate creativity programs is we just look short term. In the next 5 minutes, I could do activities that would make you more creative for the rest of the day. That's easy. We know how to do that. But they wouldn't make you more creative in a week, in a month, in 10 years. Right? That's the most important part. So check short-term outcomes, but don't forget about long-term outcomes too. That's really what we're trying to do. I'm not going to go through all those details. Shukran. If you go to jplucker.com, on the left there will be a link that says presentations, and there will be a folder for IEFE 2013, and I believe it's already up. So if you went right now, you would find it. All my contact information is here, and always feel free to email me. And if you ever want to visit the United States, you're welcome.
For distinctive and creative presentation, and we hope to benefit from this presentation in our practical life in dealing with the students in the educational process, and to lead ourselves as well to creativity through what we have said today in this useful talk. Now, I have some of the remarks. We have about 20 minutes to benefit from the professor in his answers and feedback. He is asking, he wants to do something, and he found that others got faster than him to. This is a contrast. How can he get rid of this constraint that other people are running faster than him to creativity ideas?
This is one area where intelligence and creativity are very different. Speed of thinking is highly related to intelligence. It's not necessarily related to creativity. So students will often get frustrated when they see their other students, their peers, solve problems quickly. But over time, what you have to help students realize is that there's no correlation between speed and creativity. Just because they finish first doesn't mean that their ideas are more creative. And that's very hard for students to understand because they often don't see the other students' work, right? That's one reason why I'm a big supporter of having students present their work to the class. It helps people realize that things like speed, the first person done doesn't have the best ideas. That's usually the case.
With regard to brainstorming, as a constraint to creativity, he wants more elaboration. Are there any controls to take this into consideration? Shall we have a constrained brainstorming to be a good way towards creativity?
Yeah, talk a little bit more about that. There have been a lot of studies on this now. I'm trying to think how. If well, let's say we were trying this. I can't think of a really good example off the top of my head here, but there are ways to do brainstorming that address some of its problems, but they still don't work as well as if you all went off separately and came up with ideas and brought them back together again. So if you have a very good group facilitator, he or she can help mediate those social effects a little bit. But in general, you're still not going to come up with as many ideas and as many creative ideas as if you did it separately and then brought your ideas back together. One way that we describe it to people is that when you work as a group, you don't have to work as a group. If you were writing a story or writing a paper with somebody else, would you sit in front of the computer together and do every sentence together? No, it would drive you crazy. It's very difficult to do. Why would you do that with ideas if you're speaking? It's the same exact problem. It's the same exact problem.
A question related to the students. The training of students on fluency and thinking. And is this useful in ممكن تكرر السؤال أنت كرمت؟ Is placing the students in problems, and we call the students to solve these problems. Will this enhance creativity of the students? Put them in real time and real problems on the ground.
There's kind of two questions there. The younger the student, the more naturally creative they are. As they get older, both in schools and in society, We try to get them to talk less, essentially. So a young child has lots of ideas, right? Never stop talking, never stop playing. A little child just is constantly moving ideas, very creative. As they get older in schools, we try to get them to behave. Don't yell out answers. Don't talk unless I talk to you. Be quiet and follow the rules. Over time, that has a negative effect on creativity. The more we can get them solving real problems, the younger they are when you start doing that, real world, real problems, you're helping students realize that they can control their creativity. They don't have to stop being creative in order to behave. They can channel it, they can focus it into the solving of problems. That's not easy. But there's a little evidence that the earlier you start giving them real problems, they tend to stay more creative as they get older.
This is a question about the constraints and instructions. What is the difference between them? What is the effect in creativity? How to know that this is a constraint or an education instruction? What is the difference?
So the question is, what's the difference between a constraint and an instruction? There is no difference. There is no difference. Any instruction you give is placing a constraint on somebody. But again, I'm not saying constraints are bad. Many creativity scholars, constraints bad, bad. They are not bad. They're not good. They're constraints. Every room has walls, right? Walls are technically a constraint. Walls aren't good, walls aren't bad. If you want to get to the other side, you figure how to work around the constraint. Cognitive constraints are the same exact thing. So instructions and constraints are exactly the same. Now, constraints and instructions aren't always verbal, right? When I held the coin up, I didn't say, look at this coin, right? I just held it up. Physical presence is a really big issue in some cultures more than others. In the United States, if you're a student and you're working and I'm the teacher and I go and I stand right on top of you, it really makes the students change their behavior, right? It makes you nervous. I was nervous standing next to you. So just physical space. In some cultures, students don't like you to stand. They like you to be at their eye level, especially the younger the child. So constraints, instructions, everything you do can be a constraint or an instruction. As teachers, if we can just be more aware of that and then help students realize that constraints aren't good or bad, they just are, we'd be much better off for creativity.
Is it necessary? There must be challenge and hazards and risks for creativity to go through. In other sense, does creativity related to risk taking and hazards and challenge?
That's a very good question. Maybe. Some people seem to be much more creative when they are very challenged. Other people really do need to be calm, no risks. They need to feel psychologically safe. Part of the problem with creativity, part of the problem with psychology and education in general, right, is that we try to come up with these patterns that fit everybody. But people are very different. Very different. It's complicated because people are different, but they're different in the same ways. So there are patterns. And with creativity, some people like risks. Some of you are probably like this. If I have to write something, if I'm not really sure how I can make a creative contribution, I will often wait until the last minute before it's due, and then I will force myself to write it very quickly and really stress myself out and really take some risks because I'm super challenged. But then there are other times where I'm writing something where I'm just so excited about it, I get it finished months before it's due. So even within one person, it really depends. I think we all have to ask ourselves all the time, though, about risk-taking. Am I taking enough risks? Human beings are interesting in that we thrive when we're on the edge, but we also like to be safe. And if you find yourself constantly being safe, if you find your students constantly being safe, you have to ask yourself, what am I doing in this environment that's wanting them never to take a risk? When I've taught college students, I strongly encourage them to take risks. And I tell them, if you take a big risk on a project and it doesn't work, I'm not going to hold that against you. I'll let you do it again. And the first few projects are always so boring. And I always come back and ask them, why didn't you take any risks? I told you to take risks. I'm not going to hold it against you. What do they always say? Teachers have told me that for years. And every time I take a risk, I get punished. Why should I believe you? So sometimes it takes me months to get them to learn to take risks again. So this, again, it's a lot of this is psychological.
Last question. As the difference between creativity and innovation, what is the relation between imagination and creativity? There is theory of the creative thinking. There is theory of creative thinking. We want your opinion of this theory.
This is the hardest question. Difference between innovation and creativity. I don't think there's really a difference. If I talk to an engineer, they will often tell me that innovation is applied creativity. But given our definition of creativity, applied creativity doesn't make sense, right? Creativity is always applied because it has to be useful. So I think innovation is much more of a business term, an economic term. Now the difference between imagination and creativity is also complicated. You hear the term imagination, you hear the term creativity. I just read a paper last night that talked about creative imagination. I thought all imagination was creative. So it gets complicated. I don't think they're very different.
He wants the difference between innovation and creativity.
Just innovation and creativity. I really don't think there is a difference. In business, they'll use the term innovation. They almost never use the term creativity. In economics, they use innovation. They won't use creativity. But in psychology, you wouldn't use the term innovation. You'd use creativity. They're largely interchangeable. There are, in some countries, there's a legal distinction between the two terms. But it's a very fine distinction. So. Shukran. Thank you. Thank you. And I have business cards, and I have the flyers that I can pass out about the book if anyone would like them.
Again, thanks for the professor for his presentation and for the questions, answering the question, and thanks for your attention. If you allow us to distribute the certificates.
بدون مايك ها؟ نعم. أيوه.
طال العيد